Hi, everyone. My name is Angie Breidenbach. I'm the Executive Director for the International Institute of Genealogical Studies, found at genealogicalstudies.com. Today, we're doing a fun How Montana Won the West about American records. And if you do have questions about American records, please feel free to ask them, drop them in the chat app. And it's okay to interrupt me while we're talking too. I'm not showing a screen unless needed. And so it's totally okay if you want to ask questions. And right now, the American Records includes 14 courses. And if you wanted to get your PLCGS, that is your Professional Learning Certificate in Genealogical Studies, as a credential for you as a professional genealogist, it takes 40 credits, 1 credit per course, and then you get 12 electives. Coming up later this year, this is May of 2024 that we are recording. So if you wanted to get your credentials by the end of December 31st of 2024, there are only 14 methodology courses included in that certificate and in your credentials. Starting fall of 2024, there's going to be an optional 15th, getting you all ready for January 1st, 2025, when that 15th methodology course becomes a mandatory course. That course is Latin for genealogy. We'll be releasing that for students to take optionally in the fall, and then it will become a part of the methodology program and thereby a part of all credentialing from January 1st, 2025 on. If you have finished your basic methodology and your intermediate methodology, Latin for genealogy will be an optional course for you for graduation, regardless of when you graduate. But starting January 1st, 2025, if you have not completed the first 9 courses, which are the 5 courses of basic methodology, and then the 4 courses of intermediate, this Latin for genealogy slides right into the intermediate methodology area, and it's a prerequisite then for our coming up advanced paleography course. So then that's when we have 15 methodology courses. If you've earned your basic and your intermediate certificates, you don't have to take it. We strongly suggest it because even today, there's Latin being used in your life. Now, are we making you learn how to read and write Latin? No. Are you going to learn how to speak Latin? No. What you're going to learn how to do is understand the Latin that's in the records that you'll be reading and have yourself some good reference points, because Latin is still today used in our legal documents, and it is used going backward in time, and at one point pre-mid-1850s in some countries, pre-1800s in some countries, going back into the 17 and 1600s and on, Latin is the primary language of the records. So as a good and well-trained credentialed genealogist, you will want to take this course, even if it's an optional. But we just want to make sure that you are aware of it coming up. So here's your whisper in your ear. Be prepared for Latin for genealogy. So as an American credentialed records genealogist, you'll take your 14 courses, you'll take your then 15 courses in methodology, and then you will have 11 electives instead of 12. And you can then use those electives toward any other certificate you like. Right now, DNA is a super popular one. And I'm just going to give you a little tip on something. If you would like to go and look up one of our posts on our blog, or you can see what other students have done. But if you're in the student-only group, you have to be at least taking one paid course with the school. Then you can be in the International Institute of Genealogical Studies student-only group on Facebook, and you can see some of the posts there, or over on our Facebook business page, where you can see some of the posts there, where one of our students, Lauren Robillard, has been featured in the news in Canada as having solved some cold cases on some murder investigations. Hopefully that doesn't sound lightly said, because that's a horrible thing to experience for those families. The beauty of it is a student that graduated from our DNA program has been able to use her courses to help solve that and bring closure to those families for the victims. And I'm so proud of Lauren. So just wanted to make sure that you are all aware of that. And because the DNA program is a very popular program, I thought that would be appropriate if you wanted to take those electives as part of your American and DNA program. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to talk to me. Drop a note in the chat app in the bottom right-hand corner of the website at genealogicalstudies.com. The other place you could get me is 1-800-580-0165, extension 1. So I wanted to make sure you all were up on the news with the Institute. All right. Going forward, I wanted to share with you some of the things I learned while I was researching for a 6-book series that I wrote. I wrote this series based on the American records group that was set in Montana, where I was doing some research for these stories. I'd been contracted to write for a publisher. And in the process, I was writing 1 book for the publisher. I ended up writing 6 books because the information was so fascinating. And I thought it might be fascinating to you. So in this program, we're going to talk about how Montana won the West. And it started with Montana was one of the gold strikes, one of the silver strikes, one of the copper strikes, and people were coming out to do some mining. And mining became a major industry here in Montana. Well, then you had the problem of how do you feed the miners? How do you feed the businesses and things that spring up around the miners? How do you get those goods and services to to the Montana territory? So there were things that started happening very early on, but let's just start in the 1860s as Montana was a territory. They would do massive cattle drives that just literally on horseback, massive cattle drives up from Texas all the way across the country up into Montana. And they started to have huge cattle businesses because we're part of the Great Plains in our state. And if you look at Montana, let's say this is Montana, and you're going west to east. If you're over here in the west, you've got the Rocky Mountains that come down through the state, and they create what's kind of considered the banana belt here. And it's a little bit warmer pocket where you can grow a lot of produce, trees, cherries. Flathead cherries are very famous here. And if you are a Montanan, you know when those cherries are out. They're a dark, sweet cherry. They've become a staple product out of Montana. Well, the grasses and the hay were also very sweet and would grow early and grow in late into the fall. And so the cattle grazing and the horse grazing was really, really good. There's one problem with the grass and the hay in Montana, and it is that it is a little bit more sugar. So for instance, we own 2 miniature horses, and we have to watch our horses. They can't be out on the grass in the sunshine because the sun, of course, you've got that photosynthesis going on, and there's more sugar in the grass in the daytime than there is at night. So our horses graze at night, and they are in their stalls in the daytime, maybe a little bit opposite of what other people might do in other states. And the reason is that our horses will, they'll get Cushing's, they'll get colic, they'll get sick from the sugar in the grass because it's so sweet, but it's fantastic for helping with your beef and your dairy cattle. So they've done a lot of that kind of stock animal here in Montana. Just recently, we found out that the stock sales is closing. One of our very famous, very old stock sales is closing. It was pretty much a shock because that has been open for going on, 175 plus years. So it was a real surprise for us that that stockyard, that sales area is closing. But the grasses and all that being so important, we started to get into where big sprawling ranches would be. So they got these cattle drives going and they started selling the cattle. And then the trains started to come. Well, the people who drove the cattle, also there would be these the carriages and the I don't know, like where they would deliver the mail, and they would bring in these were owned by certain people. They weren't actually government owned. And so the transportation, if you were going to do a stagecoach or a carriage ride from one state or one place into Montana territory, they were pretty much owned by specific individuals. And these people were in the Montana territory so early that I'm going to stop here for a moment and have you think about, as our times change and we move from one technology to another, we as human beings move with it. Well, we don't really think about stagecoaches, blacksmithing, and these wooden wheels with metal on them or something, uh, being one technology, moving to trains as another technology. But really, that's what it was. The human beings that lived in this area, that were farming in this area, that were taming the West, were going from the stagecoach and the wagon trains and the wagon rides, all these kinds of things into trains. And so as these trains came through, one of the Golden Spikes was put into place in Montana, and it connected the West Coast to the East Coast here in Montana. Another one was driven down in Utah, and it connected North and South. But what was really fascinating to me, being born in Las Vegas, Nevada, Clark County, never dawned on me that my roots came out of Montana. What happened was, it wasn't that I had family up here, but it was that William A. Clark, who originated as one of the cattle barons and then transportation barons and then copper barons, so the mining, this kind of thing, he's the main reason that the city of Las Vegas was founded. The reason for that was he needed to be able to get his goods back and forth between California and Montana. There was an oasis out in the major hot desert where they founded Las Vegas. There used to be an aquifer, which I believe is now dried up. But that aquifer would bubble up, had a great oasis there. And then in about 1913, Nevada became a state. That would never have happened if it hadn't have been for the Montana mining and cattle baron, who is William A. Clark. And they named the county that Las Vegas was founded in Clark County. Voila, we now created another state. So I thought that was really a fascinating fact, how tied together Montana and Nevada were. Now, I live in Montana. I was born in Nevada, and I learned this probably about 5, 6, maybe 8 years ago, that William A. Clark was really the reason for Clark County existing in Nevada. And I think it's fascinating when you start to research the names of the counties, of the states, of the American states that you either live in or you are researching in, because that individual that county was named after, and many of them are named after individuals, had a lot to do, not just with maybe the history of that state, but where they came from. You can start tracking them back through time. So I found that absolutely fascinating. My husband and I went over to a town here in Montana called Butte. It's about 2 hours, not quite 2 hours away from where we live. And we stayed overnight in in his mansion. And it was called the Copper King Mansion. It's a pretty fantastic place. In there, they had what's called a needle shower. One of the things that fascinated me about even taming the West again is that William A. Clark's son had some really difficult issues going on with his medical needs. And so this needle shower was literally a round cage, and it goes way, I'm 5'6", my husband is about 6 foot, and it was much taller than him. And in this round cage, there's little spigots of water that spray out in really tiny, very hard streams. And the goal of this was medicinal. We did get to use the shower, which I nearly drowned in. And that story, the man who was using the boy and the man who they were using the shower for this medicinal purpose were much taller than me. And what happened was these rings of metal with these holes that would pressure the water out through them literally came right here on me. So I was drowning trying to take a shower, but the spray came at you this way, all the way down your body. And the point of this high pressured spray was to stimulate the blood in your body and have your circulation get more stimulated, so for your health. And what's interesting about that is in Helena, Montana, and we're going to talk about the capital here in just a moment, there was a hot springs, and that hot springs also had needle showers, but not just coming down from at you from the sides, but up from below. And that was pretty fascinating. Unfortunately, that particular resort, the Broadwater Resort, was destroyed. It was partially damaged, pretty badly damaged in an earthquake of 1935. But then it was demolished in the 1960s, and people could go in and buy all sorts of these amazing collector's items out of this Broadwater hotel and resort. And it had what they called a natatorium. The natatorium was a gorgeous, very elaborate swimming pool with rocks that people could climb up to the top and dive off into the hot spring pool that had been built below. It had like a snack bar candy store where you could get ice cream or candies or food, and chairs that looked like maybe the ice cream shop chairs that you might imagine from the movies or something, but there's just really cute little chairs and tables that were all around it. And people would go to this resort via a trolley. Well, let's talk about that. So these needle showers were for your health. People would go there. They'd be from the hot spring. How did you get to the Broadwater Hotel and Resort and the natatorium? Well, this whole complex was modeled after the gorgeous complexes that you would see in Europe. And one of the things that was fascinating about Helena, Montana, as the capital, was that Helena was one of the first cities in the world to have full electricity throughout the city, and it had electric trolleys. And Helena and the state of Montana became a state in 1889. Helena became the capital through some rather nefarious means. We'll get there. So to get to this natatorium and take the waters for your health, there was all sorts of other grounds, out on the grounds, things you could do like ice skating in the winter, maybe a little bit tennis or badminton, walking the grounds on the paths. It was quite a beautiful area. But you had to take a trolley because it was on the outskirts of the town or the city of Helena. Well, we were talking about how William A. Clark and some of these people were, they owned the train lines. They built the train lines at the time, and they kind of controlled them. Well, before the city went to full trains, they had in Helena, Montana, which is about 2 hours, a little bit to a different direction, up in the mountains, they had two different trolley lines that were owned by two different competing men. These men had such pride, neither one would bend for the trolleys to meet at the same time. So one of the biggest problems in Helena in the 1880s and early 1890s was that these two men would fight and argue so bad and refuse to let their trolleys meet so that people could go. One owned the east-west and one owned the north-south. So if you were trying to come in from one area, jump on the other and go to work, you were always late to work. This was a major complaint in the newspapers. This was a major complaint at the city councils. So there's a lot of records that you can go through and find in like the Montana Historical Society and the museum there. You can find them in legal records. There was a lot of upheaval for the people in the town of Helena because they couldn't get to work on time because these two men would not bend their pride to work together. Nothing ever changes under the sun, does it? Someone's always involved with fighting with somebody else, and it affects everybody else. So this was something that was absolutely fascinating. And finding this out made it very humorous for me to write about in one of my books. But as we go through and the trolleys become replaced by trains, they one of the things that happened, now we're going to go hop back to 1883. The trains were coming through, they were coming through the Great Plains, they were delivering goods and services, and people would be so excited, they would run out and meet these trains. And they would unload and would help each other. It was a really wonderful time because there was so much excitement every time a train came through. The fascinating thing about this was the schedules. Now, we're all used to the time zones. I ended up writing a whole nother book on time zones because the train companies that expanded across the country, and of course, that golden spike that went in here in Montana, there's actually some placards at one of our stops on the highway, a rest stop, where you can go read the history of that golden spike being driven in. And it's quite a fun stop to do if you're on a car travel. It's in between, closer toward Missoula, but in between Missoula and Butte on I-90. That's where they drove the golden spike. Well, of course, sure it wasn't really gold, but they say it was. There's a giant mural that's painted in the state capitol based on this scene. And people came from all over the place. And one of the places they came from was called Racetrack, Montana, still exists today. And that existed because, remember I told you about the cattle and the horses that would graze up here? There was literally a racetrack built in Montana for horse racing. And Montana had, now a lot of those horses are raised in Kentucky and Tennessee, but Montana had one of our mining barons, one of our famous, very rich people, had these horses that he was breeding and raising, and they were racing at I don't even know if you could call it a town, but we'll call it a town of Racetrack, Montana, also off of I-90 between Missoula and Butte. And this is where these beautiful walking horses would race, and they would then send these horses when they were purchased back east via these trains. So there was some amazing things that were happening that are maybe a little bit less known, such as the horse racing in Montana. And those horses now, they don't really have them here, and they don't race them at Racetrack, Montana. But it was a huge thing in the late 1800s. So that definitely influenced the need for trains. We needed the goods and services, we needed the cattle, we needed the horses, we needed all those things transported back east for sale. And so a lot of these cattle drives, and some still happen today, would go between these areas of Butte, Montana, and Helena, Montana, and you would get a lot of these cattle put onto the trains and sent back east so that they could be sold there. So they would go auctioned here, then they would maybe go somewhere else and be auctioned again, possibility. So this is where Butte and Helena were a huge part of the formation of the state of Montana, but then also a huge part of the formation of the state of Nevada, and a major part of the transportation industry across the entire country, all the way down into California, back into Chicago, and over into New York. So this is how the time zones became affected and started. In 1883, there had been for quite a few years a lot of, let's say, unusual crashes on the train tracks. And it didn't matter whether it was east or west or whether it was north-south. But what was happening was that a cow might be in the middle of the train track because we didn't have fences. It was all kind of open grazing. And so the train would hit the cow and the train would tip over, and all these people would also then be injured or killed. This was happening regularly. So that's when they started going, we better fence in these cows. And then on top of that, a train might leave, say, Chicago, and they'd say leaving at noon. Well, there wasn't anything saying what time noon was except where the sun was in the sky. So noon Helena would be different from noon Butte, which would be different from noon Missoula. And this would be across the entire country, literally across the whole world. So time zones came into place in 1883, and there's definitely records on this that you can find historically. And the people that were involved with it were not what you would think. They weren't the government. The government didn't establish the time zone until many years later. Time zones were established by the heads of the railways throughout Canada, the US, and Mexico. And then the rest of the world began adopting it. And it had everything to do with the fact that if it were noon in Helena when the train was leaving and noon in Butte when the train was leaving, two different trains were leaving at noon, and they were leaving at different times because where the sun is overhead changes even by 10 miles. So the way people used to get the time to set their watch by was if you could hear the nearest church clock chime noon. And so those bells would start to ring noon, and everybody within the hearing distance would set their clock to noon. Well, that didn't work when two trains were leaving at two different noon times. So this is where they went into a series of meetings and eventually in 1883 adopted the time zones so that noon in Helena would be the same time as noon in Missoula. And you would be within a time span, or a distance span was your time span. And that's how we got the time zones. And it had a lot to do with the crashes that were happening across the country, but particularly in the Great Plains and Montana, because we had such a huge amount of space for it to be. If you were to drive in a car now from one side of Montana to the other side of Montana, it's a 2-day drive. And so you can imagine that noon might be a little bit different on the east side versus the west. So that is an important thing to know. And then you have things that were happening here in Montana, like one of the greatest disasters, and we'll talk more about that in June at our June meeting. But the largest fire in US history affected nearly the entire world. Part of the problem was that there was it wasn't just a trifecta of things, there was more. We'll get into all of that in June. But because of the trains going through a particular valley and the mines that were done, that were in that valley and the villages that had sprung up in there, when that fire happened, it wiped out 3 million acres. So because of that, it literally changed the face of the earth, and all of the different forestation and trees and plant life that were in that space are no longer there. And so it changed how we did things and how it looked, and even some of the farming. And one of the things that came out of that was a particular fireman's tool called the Pulaski, which is now used all around the world. And Edward Pulaski is one of the heroes from that disaster, and we'll talk about that in June. So the time zones were affected mainly because of what was happening with the trains going through the Great Plains in Montana. Transportation was affected because of the Montana barons that needed to get their goods and their services, their cattle, their horses into other parts of the country. And then farming procedures changed. This one was really surprising to me when I was doing all of this different history. And the women of Montana went to in 1893, they went to the World's Fair in Chicago, which was called the White City. And the World's Fair there had, they all voted, the state of Montana was new. They wanted to show that they were not backwards, they were not the Wild West. They wanted to show that they were a beautiful, genteel society out here in Montana. Because we still had all of those Wild West shows going through, people really believed that it was a very wild, untamed country. So the people of Montana voted and decided to go to the World's Fair to prove that not only did we have a genteel society, but that we had an intelligent and well-run society and very modern society. So they voted to spend $100,000 at the World's Fair and show off Montana, Montana's goods, Montana's people, and Montana's education abilities. And the men got, I know you'll be shocked by this, 90,000 of those dollars. The women were allotted 10,000 of those dollars. And on the way back, they had to make an accounting. So this was it came out of the Montana Treasury, new state. So the men decided to do their display of mining, which was wonderful. But some other things happened in 1893 that are going to affect all of this. So the silver mining, the copper mining, and a bit of gold mining, but really the copper and the silver were a big deal. And the men put on display in a particular building all of their mining prowess. And they even built this full gorgeous, beautiful Statue of Liberty that was a little different than the Statue of Liberty in in New York. This one was called Miss Justice. And Justice has a blind eye. And so there were different versions of her that showed liberty and justice, and whether she was blindfolded or whether she wasn't. This one was completely molded and then poured in pure silver from Montana mines. She became very famous, and she's now on top of our state capitol dome. So it was such a beautiful statue that it really got a lot of attention. And what was really interesting was that the men ended up getting a lot of attention for that, but it was the women who won 7 worldwide medals for what they had done. They went through for I think a year prior or the summer prior, and then displayed it during the World's Fair. There was a women's pavilion, and inside that was the Montana Women's Pavilion. So inside these giant buildings were built buildings, and you would walk into each building inside the giant building. So that always amazed me. So you'll have to look up the World's Fair of 1893 in Chicago, and the pictures online and things they're stunning. Yeah, that's a fun thing for you to do. But Montana completely changed the world's opinion of not just Montana, but of the United States. Because instead of being something that was so brazenly wild and uncouth and no manners, that kind of thing, they proved themselves as very modern and genteel. And they were even acclaimed for having beautiful women, which I thought was neat. But the fact that they were smart was super cool. So these women won 7 medals for their display of the flora of Montana. One woman was known to have put all of her children, including a nursing baby, in her wagon, and she went around farm to farm to farm every day for months, collecting unknown seeds and plant life. And together, these women put in a massive display of all the flora found in Montana, all the plant life of seeds, and it was just stunning and gorgeous display. And so these women won 7 international awards for this, for their scientific knowledge and their addition to the knowledge of science worldwide. Stunning. So it's really fun to not just talk about how we affected the transportation, but also how we affected science here in Montana, and how we affected the way people viewed the Wild West, that it had been tamed. And that was really interesting part of how the changing times Montana came into the world view. We're still known for our wildernesses. We're still known for our bear and our wildlife. I live in a little valley where we have black bear, we have mountain lions, and of course we have horses, dogs, cats, everything else, and people in their houses. But this is where I live, happens to be where 37 different mountain lion territories converge. It's the largest convergence known. And we got to watch out for them. So our little children are always under eye, we're always paying attention at dawn and dusk. So very important. But knowing that the farming techniques, things like this, changed as well because of what these women learned. Used to be that people didn't really pay attention to what direction they would plant the plots of what they were going to grow. But as these women were doing their studies, they learned that if you planted north to south, Didn't matter how far north to south, whether it was miles or feet. The plants on the north grew slower than the plants on the south in Montana. So they started doing these studies. And so now it's learned that it's sometimes better if you plant your gardens so that they're growing east to west, because then the sun follows them across. That was learned from that science that the women of Montana took in. A funny thing that came out of that was that 90-10 thing. So the men came back from the World's Fair having spent absolutely all of their $90,000. And they did a gorgeous display that poured pure silver mold of Miss Justice. But what was fascinating was the women who'd been given $10,000, they went, they took all of their stuff, they bought their furniture there, and then they brought their furniture back. And some of that furniture, chairs, desks, tables, now are in things like the governor's mansion and the state capitol. And they're now, of course, prized antiques. But those women came back with around $3,500. So they came back having been very frugal and returned $3,500 to the Montana State Treasury. And I always thought that was pretty unique, that they were frugal women who still did a gorgeous display, won 7 international awards, and did not waste their money. And today we have antique furniture on display in our Capitol and our governor's mansion that those women bought in Chicago at that time. So I thought that was very fascinating and fun fact. I think when you start to follow the stories of transportation, the stories of farming, when you start to follow things like the World's Fair, when you understand where the first cattle came from in the area that you're at, or the mining operations. One of the things that happened in 1893 was a massive problem with the economy. The economy bottomed out, and they were trying to decide whether they were going to use a gold standard or a silver standard or what they were going to do. And a lot of the copper that continued to be mined was needed for some of the things that were going on with technology at the time. So Montana, a lot of the gold mines closed, a lot of those towns turned into ghost towns. There are some gem mines that they were existing. So we mined sapphires, and we also mined, oh, I should have worn my necklace to show you. And they also mined garnets. One of the things that they mined garnets for, and it continued on into World War II, so we even affected the way that we protect our country through garnet mining, was that these garnets can be used for sandblasting, for cleaning things. So if they're not gem quality, a lot of the garnets that are mined are used for sandblasting. And that is a huge difference of what you would think that a gemstone might be used for. So we still mine some of those things today, and we still affect how architecture is built and handled today through some of the things that we mine. One of the things that came out of mining that was a disaster and is still, it's one of the world's known disasters, is the Berkeley Pit in Butte, Montana. It is filled with poison water that came out a lot of the tailings of those mines, because the groundwater continues to back up into that mining pit. It was a strip mine. And to this day, they're working on ways to stop this Superfund site from continuing to poison around. It's just heart-wrenching. And they've had to put nets over the top to stop the geese from flying in and drinking the water or landing and thinking they can swim there. But all of the caves that, the mining tunnels that were built, all of that groundwater has soaked up that tailings and then is constantly filling up the Berkeley Pit. So we've also had some sad things happen out of the progress within Montana. They're working to try to preserve and save that town of Butte because of that strip mining that happened there. So there's some things like that the stories are really difficult to dig into. But one of the things I think is fascinating about doing family genealogy and historical studies is the cautionary tales. We have all these wonderful heroes. Yes, we all want to be related to heroes and royalty and all that stuff. But those cautionary tales, those things that we learn from as human beings, are also important, and they're important to be remembered. So don't shy away when you find that your ancestor may have been involved in something that caused harm in their day, because it's also important that we don't repeat those mistakes. And when we remember history and we remember our genealogy and we remember people that are both heroes and cautionary tales, we do that. So I think that there's probably more I could tell you, but I think how Montana became so involved in the transportation and the mining and the science of the world today, I think is fascinating and a really fun story to tell. If you have any questions, go ahead and ask, and I'm done presenting. We'll turn off the recording as soon as we've found out if there's any questions that come out of that. One thing I'll tell you, I found a lot of these records in an unusual place, I thought, because I was a new genealogist at the time as I was beginning this research. I did go to Helena, did some tours of the capital. I went to Butte, I did some tours of Butte. I went in and did a lot of newspaper studies. But in my local library, there was what we called the Montana Room. And in the Montana Room were journals of the people of that time and even clippings that were kept. And I even got to read the journals of the women who chose the bitterroot as the state flower of Montana, and their personalities came through. And so that's why I wanted to preserve that history too, why I wrote that book in the whole series that I wrote, was that I felt like there was so much really unique and interesting history in it, and I wanted that preserved. So the series that I refer to, in case anybody's interested, is the Queen of the Rockies series, and there are 6 books in it. And we go through a lot of things from the beginning cattle and horses and trains. We go through the bitterroot being chosen as the state flower. We talk a little bit about the soiled doves of the West, which many of you know is a euphemism for the women that were in prostitution, and how some of those women ended up married or becoming businesswomen. I also went down into a town called, and there's 2 of these towns named with the same name. One is in Nevada, one is in Montana, but Virginia City. Fantastic place to go. You really want to be there for 2 or 3 days. Doesn't seem like it because you can literally walk that town in a couple blocks one way, a couple blocks another. But the history and the fact that people abandoned that town with their stores fully intact, you can see how they lived in that time. But there's lots of things to do, from mining for sapphires and mining for gold to riding a short train ride over to Nevada City, where you can see how the buildings and the people lived. There was a wealthy couple that collected buildings from all over Montana, brought them back, and created Nevada City, preserving the history of those buildings, including the stories of the people that lived in them. So you can go into Nevada City, tour it as if it were a city of itself, but really what it is buildings brought from all over Montana and preserved through this couple's generosity. And then when you go over to Virginia City, you can stay in a hotel that would be like the 1860s through 1880s. Very fascinating, no air conditioning, be aware in the summer. And then you also can see some of the museum there where you learn the first Black businesswoman in Montana, she ran the waterworks. And so it's fabulous to listen to this. Now I'm going to get back to one part of the story that I had left out, and that was, how did Helena become the capital? Well, first of all, as a Montana territory, we had a town that is now a ghost town, and people love to go to this ghost town. And they were originally the capital of the territory. And as soon as the name comes to me, I'll tell you. But then what happened was the Virginia City struck, and the mines there started to get really big. And so they became the center of Montana. They became the capital of Montana Territory. Well, then the Helena wanted to be the capital, but so did another town called Anaconda. And Anaconda still has a big smelter there and all this stuff going on. It's still big for, the mining. And what the posse got together, well, I don't think you could call it a posse because it wasn't really legal, but they went down, knocked out the man who held the charter for the capital of Montana Territory, got into a safe, stole the papers, and whisked them off to Helena. And because they were now in Helena and they were in the possession of the people in Helena, Helena was proclaimed the territory capital. But that still didn't make it the state capital. Well, we weren't quite civilized because we had to keep knocking out and stealing the papers. And as we became a state, nobody could decide whether it was going to be Anaconda or whether it was going to be Helena. So they put it to vote. Well, that was a smart thing to do because, it's very democratic. And then the votes were stolen. So it went back and forth and back and forth. And eventually they made some behind the door deals, and Helena became the capital. But that is this whole stealing the papers, stealing the votes, this kind of thing went on for 25, 30 years. It took us a long time to get civilized here. Just saying. And then from there, the trains would run through. There were passenger trains, everything. And now they're talking about bringing some passenger trains back so that they would go back through the city of Missoula. And I'm kind of excited for that. I would really like to be able to do a passenger train with some overnighting and go see the country that way with one that comes through Montana. Currently, if you want to ride a passenger train through Montana, you're really close up to the Montana border. And that brings one more story to mind before we end. And that one is that of prohibition. So there was this guy, you might recognize his name, Al Capone. And he was in Chicago. Well, when he had enough money that he had his own train car, his own engine. I mean, he had his own train. So if he didn't like you and you were disappeared, they would put you on that train, as the story goes. Some of this is legend, but we're pretty sure it's true. And that train would come from Chicago all the way through, and then it would end really close to the Canadian border. And that town has an underground city. I'll tell you about that here in a sec. So Al Capone would put somebody he wanted to get rid of on that train, and then they would go to what we call the High Line, which is it's raised up high, close to the Canadian border, and they would walk across and dump the body on the Canadian side. Therefore, they disappeared. This town's underground town became a part of the world all the way up through World War II. In the late 1800s, when it was burned down in the middle of winter, what had been underground were, of course, the opium dens and the gambling and all the things you weren't supposed to do. And there were some red light district areas, but they were all underground. And there was some tunnels that would go up into certain places, like certain hotels, the things like this. And then if the person staying in the hotel wanted to go see a lady of the night or go visit an opium den, they would go through a certain door, they would go down underground, and they would be able to go into these different, very decorated rooms that were underground. One night in the, I want to say it was 1880s, the town completely burned down. And so they went underground right away. And it was just an overnight save the people of this town. And they, in this town, it's called Havre, Havre, even the undertaker, even the mayor's office, even the doctors and the restaurants, everything, even the hotels, everything moved underground all at once. And because of this, it was quite a huge thing. And I'll show you really quick on screen here, just because it's kind of fun. But if you wanted to see Havre Underground, this is what it looked like. It was quite amazing. This is a Chinese laundry that was under there. They had a dairy under there. They had a where they would taxidermy. They had a bar and a cafe and a restaurant. All of this stuff existed as a barber shop underground, and it was still down there. Most of it is still down there. Some of it got buried when they were building new roads and highways because it collapsed in on itself. But these places still exist, and you can go see it today. I wouldn't want to insult Havre, Montana, because this is one of the best underground tours I've ever done in my life, but it's really the only thing to do there. So they have a Forby's restaurant where you can get the best tomato soup in the world, and they have a couple of stores, and some of our Canadian friends come down and do Black Friday shopping there. But this is where Al Capone would come and get rid of those he didn't want around. And there were speakeasies, there was just everything underground. So if you have an overnight that you want to spend, you do need to call in advance so that they have a docent that can walk you through and tell you the tour. That is a fabulous thing to see and do. But now you know we even were involved in Al Capone's dirty deeds and prohibition. So there you go. That is Montana, how he affected things. And I think it's a pretty special place to live. And I think it's pretty wonderful to know how we affected the world, not just the Wild West becoming tamed, but the world around us, from science to people to styles to even having one of the first electric cities in the world. So thank you for being with me. And what questions do you have? Everybody's quiet. All right. What I'm going to do then is if you want to hang out with me for a minute afterwards, we're going to turn off the recording. Thank you, everyone who is watching. And for those of you watching in the future, you can find us at the International Institute of Genealogical Studies. We are at genealogicalstudies.com. There is a chat app. You can go straight to me. I am Angie, the Executive Director. And we've been talking about American records today, some of the history about the Wild West. Thank you.